see if we're live on Facebook yet. Maybe Kendra can let me know. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for your patience as we were sorting out some technical issues. Glad to have you with us today, and we'll get started in just a minute. Okay, actually, we're ready to go right now. So yeah, welcome again to everyone joining us, whether you're here in our Zoom room or if you're on Facebook. We're really excited to have you with us today. While the museum is closed, you know, we love bringing you these virtual tours each week. Before we start, I just want to go over a couple kind of housekeeping guidelines. So if you're in our Zoom room, we ask that you stay muted, which you are right now. So just keep that microphone off while our docent is presenting. Throughout the tour, there will be a couple times when Barbara, our docent, asks for questions or comments. And so at that time, we absolutely invite you to unmute yourself and join the conversation. But while she's presenting, we just ask that the microphones stay off. And then, like I said, yeah, so we'll have a couple times when you can ask questions throughout the tour. But if not, you can also use that chat function. So there's the speech bubble at the bottom of your screen. It says chat underneath. You can go ahead and hit that and put any questions and comments that come up throughout the tour, and we'll get to those either in the kind of periods throughout, or at the end, we'll do a big Q&A where you can ask any questions that you forgot. If you're on Facebook, you can also join the conversation by putting your questions and comments in the comment section below the video on Facebook. And we're monitoring that, so we'll bring you in from Facebook as well. So with that, I want to turn it over to our docent, Barbara Morgan, who will be presenting Analyzing Art Through Deeper Awakenings. So Barb, you can go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Allison, and welcome everyone, and happy Thursday. As you can see from the top of the screen, I've entitled this docent presentation, Analyzing Art Through Deeper Awakenings. And to help understand where I got this title from, I'd like to move on here. When we learn, whether it is about an art piece, a piece of literature, we're a little kid, we learn to use a new toy, any aspect of life, this is how we learn. So first, we see, hear, touch, smell through our senses, and we name it, and we can hopefully remember it down at the bottom. Then we go to moving along with higher order thinking. We explain it, and if we can explain it, it means we have a degree of understanding. The next level of higher order thinking is we apply it. We use it in other situations. I think about a kid with a little ball, a first or a 1-year-old, 1.5-year-old. You know, he learns or she learns, this is a ball, they remember it. And then next time they might say to somebody, ball, and then they apply it, they learn to throw it. They're hoping somebody will catch it and throw it back to them. And as we mature in our thinking, we begin to analyze, which means we explore other understandings that grow from that initial one. What I'm not going to deliberately do with our 5 paintings that I'm going to explore with you today is I'm not going to go through a justification, or we're certainly not going to create a new. But oftentimes that is what happens. If we didn't do that as human beings, certainly we would probably still be back in that caveman era or before that. We have all expanded on what has come before us somewhat. Now, does anybody have any points of clarification or any questions about this aspect of it before I proceed to 5 of the paintings? Okay, I'm going to move on. And my first paintings will encompass the 3 religious paintings that are at the Timken. And I know that some of you online today have seen these before. And what I'm going to try to do is I've thought deep about maybe trying to have a little bit of a different aspect of understanding. And what we have here is a painting that is a Russian icon. And those of you who know the history of our Timken Museum know that the impetus for this museum originated with sisters who came with their parents from the East Coast in the early 1900s. And the three sisters were well educated, and they developed an interest in art, specifically art that is depicted here, Russian icons. And then their collection evolved to the founding of a foundation, and then the museum being built in this post-modern architectural style that some of us are very familiar with in Balboa Park. Now, this icon, obviously, we do not know a particular author, but what we do know, as you can see from the writing on the side of it, it's depictive of Saint Basil with scenes from his life, and I'm going to show the specificity of that in a moment. It was done in the 16th century in its Russian icon, and they had two main schools that did these icons, and one is, of course, listed there as the Moscow school. Icons, as many of you know, that word means an image, and these were images that were done either for personal preferences in people's homes, or they were placed in churches, and they were done for personal prayer, personal devotion, or more of a liturgical prayer and devotion. And that liturgical obviously is referring to a group of people within their church. Now, this particular icon, in the museum itself, it's relatively large. And the highlight of it, I'm showing you with my pointer here, is Saint Basil. And Saint Basil is a saint that is very honored in the Eastern Orthodox Church, of course, of which Russian Orthodoxy is a part of that. Now, Saint Basil lived in the 4th century, even though this was painted in the 16th century. And he is shown, his whole body is shown here, and he's looking out at us, the viewers. And what we have here, and we have him standing, he has a beard, which depicts so many men of that era, and the fact that they are strong, courageous men. And in his right hand here, he is holding the book of the Gospels, or our right, his left, excuse me. And then his other hand, he's showing two fingers that he has up that are what priests often do to give a blessing, either liturgically or personally. And then two behind him are called, these are called roundels, R-O-U-N-D-E-L. And these roundels here show that, let me see, up here is the Virgin Mary, and then here is Christ. He's wearing, of course, the liturgical vestments, showing him here as an archbishop. Now, I want to real briefly go around his main picture, which shows these scenes from his life. Here we have the birth of Saint Basil. This is depictive of his education. This shows him with his friend Saint Gregory. And Gregory also became an archbishop of the early church, and it shows the two of them here preaching. And here we have the baptism of Saint Basil. Now, moving down after the baptism, we have this miraculous appearance of Christ to Saint Basil, intuitively saying to him, I want you to follow me and do works on my behalf, which of course is what he did do. Many of us now would say perhaps that came through prayer and through reflection and contemplation, and he discerned that for himself, that's what his call in life would be. And then moving down here, we have Saint Ephraim. Saint Ephraim in the early church was not certainly a holy person initially. He was far from it, but it kept bothering his conscience. And so he's always observing people who have this holiness, and he didn't. And here this shows Saint Ephraim, or to be Saint Ephraim in the future, Ephraim witnessing Basil celebrating the liturgical mass. Here we have a miracle that is being performed by Saint Basil. Now, before I get here, I would like to go back up to the left here. And here we have Saint Basil, who he did follow the discerning contemplation that he experienced, and he became not only a priest of the Orthodox Church, but a bishop. And here we have him when he is being revealed to Ephraim later on in Ephraim's life. And then he eventually ordains Ephraim, and Ephraim becomes a priest. And here is another miracle that was performed by Saint Basil. A second miracle. And then this is depictive of the death of Saint Basil, and finally his funeral. So here we have Saint Basil with scenes from his life. Now, I'd like to conclude this observation of this painting with words I found that a historian had captured, and it's said that Saint Basil uttered these words. I'm sure the thoughts are his. Most likely the words have been paraphrased and paraphrased through the centuries. But here are the words, and it goes so much in keeping with what we learn about him. He said, "We should not express our thoughts merely in words, because the power of words should be expressed in the moral attitude of our souls, in the virtuous actions that extend throughout our lives." So here we have Saint Basil, who contemplates, who meditates, who he does good works, but he doesn't just preach about it, he lives those words. And we are being invited here to do the same thing, to live those words and to learn about it, to analyze it, and to make it our own. One of the most famous paintings in our museum is this one. And this one just was acquired by our Timken Museum actually just a few years ago in 2015. And that was upon an anniversary of the Timken Museum. And I'm going to refer to that again in a few moments. This painting is done by one of the great Spanish painters of the 1600s, the 15th century, de Zuberan. And he was a person who left his home to study with another great Spanish painter who was known before his time. And that painter, some of you know this name, is Caravaggio, and he was a great painter. And from him, he learned many of the techniques and also topics that were painted by the painter who came before him. When he left the study, he established his own art studio. He always remained in France, and he painted mainly for religious orders. He did a little bit of painting for non-religious orders, like he painted for the king. Some of you may have heard Jan and I speak at a couple of weeks ago. And the king, who was King Philip IV, said, or he's known to have said, "Zuberan, you are the painter to the king, but you are king of the painters." So that's certainly, that idea depicts the fact that he was certainly highly respected as a painter. As I already said, he was commissioned by a lot of religious orders, and those were those monastic orders that he also started himself, the Franciscans, and we had other orders and religious people individually who commissioned works. And he was known to have done, Zurbarán was 34 copies of St. Francis in meditation that spanned around 20 years. Now, this particular painting of St. Francis shows St. Francis as the mystic, but he became like St. Basil, who we looked at earlier from a completely different perspective. He also was an activist who walked the talk. He wasn't just behind cloistered walls, but he prayed and he contemplated and he went out, especially among the poor. And if you know anything about the Franciscans today, they have carried on that same perspective. There are missions right here in California that are staffed by the Franciscans. In fact, in Oceanside, they have a school of theology that carries on the same thoughts that St. Francis originated. And the thoughts are these: that we dedicate our life to humility, not pride. We're peacemaking, we're contemplative, but we're also collegial. So as I've already said several times, the collegiality should stem from depth, which is the contemplation side. Now, obviously, what Zurbarán is showing mainly in this painting is the contemplation aspect. And here we have the lighting and the light and the darkness and the facial expression really showing the drama of this image. So specifically now looking at this painting, I would like to just say what we have here is we have an illumined face on the right side, and we see his face with his eyes downward. And some people believe that his eyes are looking at the skull. Another docent has learned that his eyes might be tinted a bit sideways, where he's already contemplating, what action will I carry on as a result of my contemplation? Both are operative because, and I already told you why. The skull is the symbol of his demise. And so perhaps the contemplation is, I am going to end up someday not of this world. And while I am inhabiting this world, I will do the very best I can to carry out the fruits of my contemplation. Now, upon acquiring this painting, and I already said it was in 2015, for a brief time, the Timken had an interim director. And the interim director, at the time, he was so interested in this painting, and he was hoping that the board would agree that this was the painting that the Timken should possess. And sure enough, that's obviously what happened. And David Boll was the interim director at the time, and this is what he said. It's a very, very tough painting for a lot of people. There are no bright colors, and it's very somber, but it is intensely moving. It's a remarkable painting. Now, in closing, a little bit of discussion that we've had on St. Francis, I want to say something about our current Pope. Our current Pope is named Francis. And from what I've read, that's not a coincidence. He's the first Pope who took this name. And Jorge, I believe his name was Bergoglio from Argentina, became our Pope. And when he was elected, it did not take him a long time to say, my name will be Francis. And researchers of Pope Francis has said these are his perspectives. And this is what St. Francis did. He has a devotion to the poor. He preaches mercy. He seeks to reform, and he is passionate about caring for creation. And that was something I did not cover about St. Francis, but many of us have often seen him pictured in nature with birds. And so the perspectives are the same. St. Francis never completed that. Our world doesn't live with all of that peacemaking yet. And Pope Francis, who's living now, most likely won't see that either. So maybe the message here is for all of us to say, can we do our little bit to help make this world a little bit of a better place, so that when we leave it someday, we will have contributed to this perspective also. Now, the last saint I want to talk about for just a few moments is, again, I said the St. Francis is a famous painting that we are so lucky to have here at the Timken. Obviously, this Rembrandt that was added to the museum collection well before it opened. I believe we acquired this in 1952. The foundation did, and the museum opened in the 1960s. And many people visit it just because they want to see in our Southern California area another Rembrandt. Now, this Rembrandt, as I said, is certainly very famous, and many of us already know a little bit about Rembrandt. Rembrandt is considered the Dutch painter, and his works, actually, he spent studying art about 1623, and you can see this painting is 1657. So that's some 30 years before he painted this one that he started studying just for half a year, and then he continued with it, certainly beyond that until his death. Now, he is from a place in that part of our world that was called Linden, and he left Linden to go study in Amsterdam. And then he did not stay in Amsterdam forever initially. He though he was after he studied in Amsterdam, he went back to Linden, did lots of paintings there. Then he went back to Amsterdam. When he returned to Amsterdam, he had initially many wealthy patrons, and the patrons obviously kept him prolifically painting, and many of those paintings are all over the world today. But what happened by 1650, those patrons began to not be as prevalent. And so Rembrandt was not as wealthy. But historians, as they studied that about his life, and they simultaneously look at his paintings, believe that his paintings deepened and matured and had a different perspective. And looking at this one in particular, some of that is the following. Again, it's showing light, texture, form. He had smaller and looser brush strokes, and his gazes were penetrating. This is considered a powerful painting by Rembrandt. And St. Bartholomew, as many of you already know, certainly lived in the 1st century, and he is one of the first of the 12 followers of Jesus. Now, as we look specifically here, St. Bartholomew is seated. He's another saint who is very reflective. He is wearing a comfortable brown clothing, and he's leaning to his left, and his right arm is up higher, and it's holding a knife. The knife is almost always shown with Saint Bartholomew as a symbol that his life ended with a flagging. But what is interesting about this painting, the face of Saint Bartholomew is not focused on that knife. That symbol is there as a symbol. So the narrative of this painting is really one of contemplation. It's one of where is my life now? Where is my life going? And if you look at that face and how it's furrowed and the eyes are penetrating, and the artist chose to highlight that face, that is the narrative of our story. Now, truly, this painting, I believe, has potential energy. There is a strong sense of an ethical problem, perhaps because of his eyes and what he's contemplating. And to enhance that, we see that Rembrandt used light to enhance all of that. Perhaps Rembrandt, who is called one of our great prophets of civilization, created something here that we can continue to relate to the fact that we should take time to consider, where are we in our lives and where are we going? So we look at this quote, and some of you have seen this with me before. I looked at 3 saints with you already. We looked at Saint Basil, a Russian icon. Then the Zurbarán, great Spanish painter, painted Saint Francis in Meditation. And lastly, Rembrandt's Saint Bartholomew. And I've said this before, and some of you have heard it. As a kid, I used to go to a museum, or I'd see them in other places, pictures of saints like we've just seen. And until I began to understand them, I often thought, how can any of us ever be like that? Well, this book that I came across really, I thought, said my thoughts better than I could, because Robert Ellsberg says here, and this was just written in 2019, like us, saints were people of flesh and blood, struggling to find their way, not knowing exactly where their path would take them. And I'm sure a lot of us can say the same thing about ourselves. Now, before I conclude with 2 final non-saint paintings, I would like to see if anybody has any comments, especially in light of my theme, analyzing art through deeper awakenings, trying to get to an analysis mode, not just looking at it and trying to understand it, but trying to analyze it and maybe make it a little bit a part of our own thinking. Any questions, comments so far?
We had a couple in the chat. This not exactly on your theme, but asking more about Zurbarán as a painter. So he was living in Spain, is that correct?
That is correct,
And
yes.
then what was he studying under in Spain?
Okay, Caravaggio, who was another famous Spanish painter, I believe. Let me just look at my notes here. Which is correct.
Okay.
I'm looking here at, but what is sometimes gets confusing with people is when they learn about Caravaggio. Caravaggio's first name was Michelangelo, and sometimes people would confuse him with the Michelangelo who did this, the Sistine Chapel and other famous works in Italy. They just happen to have the same first name, lived a little bit about 100 years apart. And Caravaggio, for those of you who may have studied a little bit of Spanish art, he was in history, just kind of finishing up his time when our Zurbarán came, to the forefront. But thankfully, Zurbarán, as I already said, studied Caravaggio's work. I don't know if that
Yeah, I
With,
think so. Yep, that was just a quick question.
oh,
I was kind of wondering when we were talking about Saint Basil, the first image, and you referred to the artist as the author. And I know we've maybe talked about this in other tours, but some people might not be familiar. Why do we call a Russian icon artist an author? And it kind of struck me also when you were saying the quote about let's see, Saint Basil, like the words and putting them into action. And I just thought that was an interesting play where he's comparing kind of words and actions, and here we have words and art in a way. I don't know if that makes sense.
well, that's correct. And he's called a doctor of the church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, because he was so highly educated in that time. And that's what doctor meant, not just we talk about a doctoral degree that people get now. Well, in a way, it's probably somewhat similar. The education, I'm sure, not as formalized and locked in all these pieces the way we have it today, but he was very learned, but yet he must have been so down to earth that he just spent his time giving to others.
Great. Okay. I don't think, are there any other questions? Yeah, I think maybe just in the interest of time, we should move on, but we'll have some time at the end also for questions.
Okay.
Thanks.
Now, as I said, I am going to transition in a moment here to paintings that are not of saints. But I came across in my research, especially analyzing art through deeper awakenings, these two quotes. A painting, it says, can help us think that something goes beyond our unperceived existence. Just like we can read a piece of literature, we can walk and see a beautiful sunset, a painting can do that too. And Allison, who helped me finalize these slides, Allison, I thank you because she put this picture here right from our own Timken Museum of a gentleman sitting there contemplating, art on the wall. And that's, what we all hope to get something from some art. And the other quote that I think, and it really helps us transition to where I'm going to go. Art facilitates encounter with the presence of mystery in our lives and nurtures relationships with it. So I already hinted that we're no longer going to be looking at saints. So we're going to finish up with just a couple of quick art pieces that are nature landscapes. And this is a beautiful one. It's a French painting by Claude Lorrain. This was also done in the 1600s. And this painting was actually came from Claude, and I love what I found about him. He was first and foremost a lover of nature who could rise by his very intuitions to an intensity of mood and feelings. His family sent him, I think this is such an interesting tidbit and true of many people today. He went to Rome from France, sent by his family to actually study to become a pastry chef of all things. Well, that pastry chef was also a landscape painter, and that was obviously more the interest of Claude. And so he gradually himself became this landscape painter. He spent the rest of his life in Rome. His work came to epitomize, I'm reading my notes here, a balanced classic for scholars, because he has a balance between the time, the Baroque aspect, but Baroque was, heavier work, and it was paintings that were heavy themes, dark colors, and you can see he's already transitioning, known for the lighter aspect of landscape painting. Simultaneously with his painting, and I will get into the specificity in a moment, he kept an album of all of his works. And that album is called A Book of Truth. And upon discovering this album, this is how historians have pieced together the meaning behind the paintings and what the paintings say to us. Now, in his album, they found out that he was very interested in the rural countryside, which we have here, which was, he shows carefree and timeless. But actually, we know that the rural climate was not merely that. It was full of hardship and it was subject to ongoing transformation. The weather alone would be ongoing transformation. Claude painted the sun, the earth, the water. He spent hours and hours just going into nature and contemplating it and looking at it. And then that became the impetus for his works. And they're known to show the timeless beauty of nature rather than mere portrayal of human virtues. So he is the one who is considered one who laid the foundation for other landscape painters who followed. Now, looking in particular at this painting, which is obviously a pastoral landscape, he's another artist who was fascinated by light. Sorry about that. Oh, I'm going in the wrong direction here. The light is mainly the sky here. It's the sunset and sunrise. Historians are not exactly sure which it is I discovered in my work here. The Timken painting, the long shadows and the pink tone of the clouds, they believe it could be one or the other. Even people who have looked in particular at this one at the Timken say the same thing. So coupled with looking at the light sky, the time of day, either at the onset or at the outset of the day, we have at the bottom, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time emphasizing this too much in particular, but I want to show you a few things. Here we have peasants who are driving their cattle across a river. Then we have a woman in the foreground who is drying the feet of another young shepherd. And this is watched in the back by another woman who is carrying a basket, known to be very typical scenes in rural, in the countryside at that time. On the far right, we see the nature, and up here, look at this little bit of waterfall that we see. How beautiful that in this pastoral landscape, and maybe that's why it's entitled this. It not only shows nature, but pastoral is fatherly, it's loving, it's how do we live and thank the earth and the home that we have for what is carried on by us. I found an American curator and art critic, Robert Starr, who said that about this painting. Or a painting, he said, should help us think about something that can take us beyond our ordinary existence. It should encounter and help facilitate the presence, again, this word mystery in our lives, in nature, and then our relationship with it. So it's just, as I began to kind of dissect my title, it was just amazing to me how not only my thoughts are your thoughts, but historians and other people who have looked at these paintings have also analyzed art through deeper awakenings. Now, finally, one of my very favorite in this museum is an American painting, and this is done by Fitz Henry Lane. Fitz Henry Lane was a painter who started out in life as a lithographer. And the reason that was the chosen occupation by his family is a lithographer, he could sit and he could, do work in front of him, because almost reminds me of some of the work people do today with silk screening and so on. It's putting ink on, they use stone and then creating the image. There was a lot of detail orientedness to that. But Fitz Henry Lane was disabled, and people who have lived beyond that time believe that his disability was no doubt polio, and they felt he would be hindered. Well, that did not keep Fitz Henry Lane from moving around, because he obviously evolved from being a lithographer, and he went into sketching and obviously painting. And he traveled. He was from Gloucester, Massachusetts, and that's where he learned lithographer. But he started going with friends to Maine, and this picture is Castine Harbor and Town, which is in Maine. So that is, in a nutshell, Fitz Henry Lane's background. But this particular painting here, which is so beautiful, first of all, I want to say he sketched this first. And I learned that he was sitting somewhere across on a bank looking out at this. And then when he actually painted it, he was no longer here. The painting was done from his sketch. But here we have the water is calm with distant hills, and those hills are clothed in soft light. And you can see this soft light right here, the clothing of them. The sunset is through pink and purple clouds. And we also see about 12 boats of different sizes because of the closeness or proximity to him when it was sketched. Again, you can see all this attention to detail. And perhaps you can't see some of the detail in the boats, but we have straw-hatted men and bonneted women who are in these boats. And then we have also crew members on some of these boats who stand on the deck. So that attention to detail is an element of Lane's painting also. Now, I briefly made a reference to the sky, but we also see beyond the sky rectangles of houses and buildings here. And they have a shape that's very similar to the boats. And researchers said the lithographer in Lane would have helped depict that. Now, as I come near the end of talking about this, I discovered that Lane was a transcendentalist, and many of us may have studied transcendentalism when we were in high school, studying Emerson and Thoreau and Walden Pond. And a definition of transcendentalism is God or a light force can be found everywhere. So the perspective is something deeper beyond ourselves, is not just through a religious painting or through going into a church or having a religious object. Transcendentalism taught it can be in nature, it can be in places like this. So what we have here is a magical painting that I think helps depict what Lane was about in his own life. Now, in closing, I love this artist, Wassily Kandinsky, and I don't know if Christina is still on our lecture or not, but Wassily Kandinsky is obviously Russian, but at an early age, he went to Germany and he studied and then painted the rest of his life in Germany. But he was one that was an artist, but he also was considered a spiritualist who tried to merge the two. And he wrote his famous book concerning the spiritual in art in 1911. Kandinsky lived from about 1860 something. And I believe, if I'm recalling correctly, he passed away in 1945. So this was somewhere in the middle. But he said this: art is a power which must be directed to the improvement and refinement of the human soul. And I thought that really rounds out my theme, analyzing art through deeper awakenings. And I hope I've just planted a tiny seed for all of us to continue to do that through art. So this is the end. Do we have any questions, comments, anything to add maybe?
Thank you so much, Barb. Yeah, we can all kind of give her a virtual round of applause. Thank you. And you have some really nice comments here in the chat. Becky said, Barb, thank you for a great presentation. I really enjoyed the quotes. Kelly saying, I really enjoyed the quotes you shared and the overall theme of a sort of self-reflection and focus on humanity. And a couple other people saying nice things as well. So thank you so much. And yeah, I love the way that, we looked at religious artworks, which I think people think of as, inherently spiritual, especially for the people who are viewing them, who are part of that faith. But I like that you kind of showed how, even if you're not part of that faith, there's sort of moral, ideas you can get, or contemplative ideas you can glean from them. And also then with non-religious paintings also, with secular paintings, there's also sort of a spiritual aspect sometimes. So I just thought that was so interesting, those kind of different layers.
Well, and I've run across people today, especially like when I taught college students, they would say, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
And religion is supposed to lead us to spiritual. It's religion, and all of our religions and denominations within them are man-made to lead us to this deeper reality in our lives. So, if I've ever had a chance to have a discussion following a comment like that, it's usually led that way, but sometimes you don't, and it's just a comment. And people do look at it as two different things, and oftentimes it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, and especially in art, when we see religious artworks, I think there's multiple aspects. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, are there any questions? Maybe we have just a couple minutes here. If anyone does want to unmute themselves and ask a question, you're welcome to do so now. I'm also looking on Facebook. Someone on Facebook said, thank you so much. I think the Putnam sisters would be proud of this presentation. Thank you. That's nice.
Well, who knows, what their thinking was, but I found it so fascinating that most of their collecting was all the Russian icons. And, they depict a lot of what we were learning about the saints who were painted, or certainly the artists. The Putnam sisters were highly educated. I know one went to USC, and that was the early 1900s. It wasn't as common for women to be in those high universities like that, but that probably broadened their perspective for that.
Yeah, we can definitely imagine that they were thinking about similar issues probably as they were looking at the art as well. Yeah. Well, any last comments? Like I said, you're welcome to unmute yourself if so. Otherwise, we might wrap up.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I
Thank you
appreciate
so
the
much, Barb.
feedback.
Just before we go, I want to make a couple announcements. So just to remind you all, I see some familiar names in the people in our Zoom room here. So some of you might know, but we have these tours every week, every Thursday at 11 a.m. We kind of look at a different aspect of our collection. So next week we have one as well. We'll be doing a kind of overview of the collection. But next week we also have another tour on Wednesday at 11 a.m. And that one will be our special Arts Reach tour that is led once a month by Karen Helmerson. And we will be looking at 19th century American art. So that one is at Wednesday at 11 a.m., also virtual on Zoom. You can find all the details on our website. And then we'll have our normal Thursday 11 a.m. tour of the collection on Thursday as well. So we hope to see you at one or both of those next week, but have a great rest of your day. And thank you for joining us. And thank you again, Barb, for a great tour.
Thanks, Allison. And thanks, Samantha. Thank you.